Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and firstly, let me thank the organisers for the invitation to address this particular event. It looks to me to be a very interesting discussion and prospect this afternoon, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to make a small contribution. I suppose those of us who engage with the media on a regular basis at a national or EU level could be forgiven for being slightly cynical when we're told that media, and broadcast media in particular, is on the cusp of a major structural shift, a transformation of a type that may change the very nature of the industry entirely. And perhaps this comes from experience. But there is no denying that change is in the air, or perhaps in the wires. And regardless of the precise nature or pace of that change, it is beyond question that there are real and important consequences to follow. Consequences not just for existing businesses, but also for societies and polities that have evolved hand in hand with a particular type of media ecosystem. The question for policymakers is, as ever, around the appropriate policy response to these changes. The when, the what, the where and the why. And like in all interesting policy areas, there are many questions and not too many readily simple answers. I think it's very safe to say that everyone in the industry has their own views as to what is happening. There are those that point to the ongoing resilience of the traditional linear broadcasting, particularly the growth in viewing time across the developed world, as evidence that the future will look very similar to the present. That people are too attached to the lean-back or passive model of television for any alternative to gain serious traction. Then there are those who are convinced that the linear broadcast model is already broken, that the proliferation of new media and enabling technologies has already begun to undermine important pillars of financial and content model that traditional media rely on to survive. Even within the latter group, there is a body of opinion that suggests that the very model of content generation that we're familiar with cannot be sustained when the ability to monetize viewership is as dubious as they suppose that it will be into the future. I'm not yet in possession of a crystal ball to determine precisely how all of these various different elements are going to interact and play out. But there are some things that we can say with a degree of certainty even now. Firstly, traditional broadcasting patently isn't going away overnight. This is not just due to the size or institutional strengths of the existing media operators, or even the fact of the extant commercial relationships with content providers, but to the extent to which lean-back television consumption has become embedded in our culture. We may turn our noses up at phrases like water cooler moments, but the shared nature of broadcast television, conferred as it is with an immediacy and an emotional reach with which nothing can compete, means that it is simply inconceivable that it will disappear in the short or even the medium term. The market, the public, simply won't allow that to happen. Secondly, online media is no longer really new anymore. Many broadcasters have had websites for nearly 20 years now and have been providing broadcast content online for at least half of that time. Online is already a real and significant media power in most European countries, not least because of the fact that television broadcasters themselves have grasped the opportunities that the technology offers to reach their audiences in new ways. Many countries, like Ireland, have even obliged their public sector broadcasters to engage actively online. Moreover, we cannot pretend that it is some form of a sophisticated toy or a mere vestigial add-on to a core service. The amount of advertising revenue gathered by online players already should reinforce that. In some ways, online media have already substantially remade the advertising sector. In fact, one could argue that because they have competed successfully for a declining pool of available advertising revenue, online media have already had a serious impact on both the print media and on commercial television broadcast market sector in Europe. After all, in a converged media environment, making a distinction between print, online and television advertising markets is a fool's errand in many ways. It's all just money now, and it's all to play for, or not, as the case may be. Thirdly, we know that the present situation is untenable. It cannot last. The technology holds the potential to do much more than is presently offered. While practically all existing market players have at least a foothold in the online sector, no one has yet found the killer app, the silver bullet in market terms, that will allow customers to access content in as open and flexible a way as the technology already allows. We can talk about the strength of existing content relationships or the difficulties in monetizing this type of media. But the fact remains that history tells us that this type of innate potential cannot and will not go unexploited forever. Sooner or later, someone will find a way that will build an offering that meets the clear demand for a new and innovative way of delivering content. We don't have to look too far for an example of the type of transition that I'm talking about. The mobile phone industry, for example, had been pushing various different types of smartphone for years, and there had even been a number of minor successes in that field. However, it took a new market entrant to turn the sector entirely on its head and come up with a type of product that people soon found that they couldn't do without. Sooner or later, this will happen to media too. It might be a single product, it might be a complex of linked products, or it might even be a single technology, website or market device that spans a universe of devices. But it will happen. In a general sense, changes like this occur. They are a fact of life, and we generally embrace them because of the new services and experiences that they bring to us as consumers, as viewers, and sometimes as citizens. But we also have to acknowledge that economic change can destroy too, or at the very least can rework markets in such a way as to erode the nature and quality of the services provided to society and to public life. This matters particularly in this case because of the wider role that media plays in society and in the democratic life of the modern European state. While the importance of broadcast media is already reflected in European law, the nature of the changes that we've already seen pose a profound challenge, not just to the terms of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, but to the very conceptualization of media that many of us are comfortable with. For example, if a broadcaster reaches a sizable contingent of its audience through the written word on a web page, or through audiovisual content streamed to mobile devices, is it really still entirely appropriate to call it a mere broadcaster? If a newspaper reaches the majority of its audience through a digital edition consumed on a plethora of devices and includes audiovisual content as part of that, is it really still merely a print source? In light of these very fundamental questions, much of the extant European and national law and accepted practice around media governance is clearly already open to question. This is the case even before one begins to consider more highly evolved questions about the implications of all of this for pluralism and diversity of media, or of the production of high-quality content in whatever new commercial context is going to arise. Once you begin to consider the implications of these potential developments for states, for industry, for individuals, then the realization swiftly dawns that this issue is every bit as far-reaching as it is complex. This breadth of impact has already received substantial attention from the European Commission, visible through the publication of a series of documents on media policy, most notably the recent Green Paper on converged media. The Irish Presidency hosted a breakfast discussion of ministers responsible for audiovisual matters at Council last week on this very subject. And while there were differing views on some issues, as you would expect, there was a striking degree of consensus on a couple of key issues, particularly on the fact that the existing legislative provisions are rapidly becoming obsolete, and on the fact that Europe should still seek to preserve its provisions around protecting European values. All of this begs an obvious question: where should European policy, not least the Audiovisual Directive, go, and when should any transition begin? In the first instance, I believe that we need to take a wider view than merely seeking to shore up and modernise the present directive. The issues we're dealing with now are wider and deeper than those that the directive was framed to deal with. There are concerns here about ensuring that European citizens have access to a full and rich range of commercial services, no matter where they live, but also around ensuring that certain minimum standards for quality are met on a free-to-air basis. There are issues of plurality and new issues around ensuring availability over privately owned networks as opposed to publicly owned spectrum. We need to ensure that content is not just available to all, but that there are still local markets for material so that it is created close to those consuming it. As I've already said, in all likely future scenarios, the market failure that has long resulted in the need to use public funds to support coherent, robust, and diverse public service broadcasting is not just likely to persist, it is likely to intensify. The fact that this public service broadcasting is online, available on different platforms and takes different forms, should not dissuade anyone of the ongoing need for that content to be made available. However, we must also acknowledge that this approach has implications for other media, particularly given the issues that will inevitably arise from the use of public funding in a competitive and converged media marketplace. This means that the structure and mandate of public service broadcasters needs to be continually monitored to ensure that they too meet their objects, but do not constrain commercial media who have their own equally vital role to play. There are implications too for the Council in a world which is likely to be technologically far more flat and less amenable to sector-specific regulation. We will sooner or later have to concern ourselves as to whether we can cleave forever to existing council structures or whether there is a case for a unified broadcasting and communication system. However, in a world where the traditional roles of broadcasters and media companies seem so plastic all of a sudden, it is clear that content is going to be even more important than at present. There are coherent systems in place at a European level around supporting and developing the film industry and various other artistic endeavours. On that basis, it is somewhat striking that we have never evolved a content strategy, a system to support and develop the industry that supplies content to television and increasingly online. Television broadcasting, in a European context at least, is a profoundly important artefact of our civilization. The technology will change, it must. The content, on the other hand, the diverse and plural material produced for the benefit of our populations must and will be sustained. And people must be able to access it through whatever devices are in use. This will not be an easy transition to manage, not least because it will almost certainly involve relatively profound structural and economic changes, and it will most likely require significant legislative and institutional change too. But for governments, the goal, the purpose of broadcasting, and more specifically public service broadcasting, has not changed, nor is it going to. On that basis, we cannot be found lacking in formulating a response as this develops, because the market will not wait for us, and chasing this issue is not where any of us want to be. Thank you very much indeed.